Rain drummed softly upon the wrought-iron gates of Blackwood Hall as Lady Eliza Ashcombe tightened her fingers around the worn leather handle of her only valise. The journey across England had stolen the last of her strength, yet hope had carried her through every mile. Somewhere beyond those towering stone walls lived her elderly aunt, the final branch of a family tree already stripped bare by illness, misfortune, and time. She paused before the entrance, smoothing the creases from her weathered traveling dress, whispering a silent prayer that the lonely road behind her had finally reached its merciful end. The grand estate appeared solemn beneath the gray autumn sky. Black ribbons fluttered beside the entrance, and every servant she glimpsed moved with quiet purpose, dressed in mourning. A chill settled inside her that had nothing to do with the rain. Before she could knock, the butler opened the gate, studying her unfamiliar face with gentle confusion. When she introduced herself, his expression changed from uncertainty to unmistakable sorrow. Without speaking another word, he invited her inside, leading her through silent corridors filled with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to mourn alongside the household. She was escorted into a library scented with old leather and fading lavender. Waiting beside the fireplace stood Mr. Pembroke, the family solicitor, whose lined face carried the burden of difficult news. He bowed respectfully before asking whether she had traveled from Hampshire. Eliza answered yes, explaining that her aunt's letters had promised welcome, shelter, and affection until she could rebuild her life. The solicitor closed his eyes briefly before speaking words that shattered every fragile hope she had protected throughout the exhausting journey. The Dowager Lady Ashcombe, he explained with sincere regret, had passed peacefully 12 days earlier after a brief illness. She had spoken lovingly of her niece until the very end, never imagining Eliza's arrival would be delayed by flooded roads and broken carriage wheels. Her will had already been executed according to law. The estate itself belonged to distant relatives, while every personal possession had been distributed exactly as instructed. Nothing remained except heartfelt condolences and apologies that no amount of kindness could soften. For several moments, Eliza heard nothing except the ticking of the tall grandfather clock. She had prepared herself for hardship, for uncertainty, even for disappointment, but never for absolute emptiness. Her aunt had been the final familiar voice left in the world. Parents buried years earlier, a younger brother claimed by scarlet fever, cousins scattered across distant colonies without correspondence. Every chapter of her past seemed to close at once. She thanked the solicitor with remarkable composure, refusing to let tears dishonor the dignity her mother had taught her to preserve. Mr. Pembroke quietly offered enough money for lodging until suitable employment could be found. Eliza accepted neither charity nor pity. She insisted others needed such generosity more than she did. With graceful gratitude, she collected her valise, curtsied to the household, and walked back toward the gates before anyone could witness the tremble in her hands. The rain had stopped, leaving the gardens glistening beneath pale afternoon light. Every flower appeared brighter than the future awaiting her. Outside the estate, she found an old stone bench overlooking the village road. She counted the contents of her purse with careful precision. 4 pounds, several loose shillings. Barely enough for modest lodging and simple meals before necessity demanded impossible choices. She folded the coins away again, realizing she had been performing arithmetic not with money but with days. Each calculation shortened the distance between survival and desperation. She lowered her head, wondering how quietly a respectable gentlewoman could disappear from the world without anyone noticing. The village carried on around her. Carriages rattled over damp cobblestones. Shopkeepers greeted familiar customers. Church bells echoed across the valley, reminding everyone that ordinary life continued despite private grief. Eliza watched strangers laugh together while feeling more invisible than the drifting mist rising above nearby fields. She wanted only one familiar face, one comforting hand, one voice calling her name. Instead, she possessed silence, a travel bag, and memories that could neither feed nor shelter her. Nearly an hour passed before light footsteps approached. A neatly dressed boy with bright hazel eyes stopped directly before her, studying her face without hesitation. He could not have been older than 9, yet there was quiet confidence in his posture that hinted at careful upbringing. Removing his cap politely, he tilted his head and asked with complete sincerity, "Why are you crying, miss?" Eliza instinctively wiped her cheeks, surprised to discover tears she had never felt falling. She attempted a reassuring smile, unwilling to burden an innocent child with sorrow. Before she could answer, a calm, commanding voice carried across the road. "Edward." The boy turned immediately. A tall gentleman in a dark overcoat approached with measured steps, his presence unmistakably noble even without formal ceremony. Grief lingered within his composed features, yet kindness softened every line upon his face. Beside him walked a tiny fair-haired girl clutching a faded ribbon doll against her chest. The gentleman inclined his head apologetically toward Eliza. "I hope my son has not troubled you." Edward looked between them earnestly. "I only wanted to help." For the first time that sorrowful day, hope quietly stirred. Daniel Ravenscroft studied the young woman for several quiet moments before speaking again. Rainwater still clung to the edges of her cloak, and although exhaustion shadowed her face, she carried herself with unmistakable grace. Years among England's nobility had taught him to recognize true breeding, even when fortune had stripped away every outward comfort. His son waited expectantly beside him, while little Charlotte hid shyly behind his coat, peeking curiously at the stranger who looked as though the entire world had abandoned her. "I am Daniel Ravenscroft," he said gently, "Duke of Blackwood." Eliza rose immediately and offered a proper curtsy despite her trembling legs. "Lady Eliza Ashcombe, your grace." The title surprised him only briefly. It explained her polished manners, careful speech, and quiet dignity. Whatever tragedy had brought her to his gates, she had not been born to hardship. He noticed the worn stitching upon her gloves and the fading color of her dress. They had once been expensive garments, lovingly maintained long after prosperity had vanished. Edward stepped closer. "Father, she's all alone." Daniel placed a reassuring hand upon his son's shoulder before returning his attention to Eliza. "My son tells me he found you in tears." She lowered her eyes. "I apologize if I caused concern. It was never my intention. You owe no apology for grief." Those simple words nearly unraveled the composure she had fought so desperately to preserve. Daniel glanced toward the closed gates of Blackwood Hall. "You came seeking the Dowager Lady? She was my aunt. I am deeply sorry. I arrived too late." The silence between them held no awkwardness, only shared understanding. Daniel knew the cruel emptiness that followed the death of someone whose presence had once anchored every uncertain day. 2 years earlier, he had buried his wife beneath the old chapel overlooking the estate. Since then, every sunrise had begun with duty rather than joy. Charlotte suddenly stepped from behind her father and held out the faded doll. Her ribbon came loose. Eliza blinked, surprised by the unexpected request. "Would you like me to fix it?" The little girl nodded. Eliza accepted the doll with remarkable gentleness, removing a tiny sewing needle from the inside seam of her valise. Within moments, she carefully secured the ribbon exactly as it had once been tied. Charlotte smiled. "It looks prettier. I believe your doll agrees." The child hugged the toy tightly before reaching for Eliza's hand without hesitation. Daniel noticed. Charlotte had refused to approach strangers since her mother's funeral, yet somehow she trusted this woman immediately. Edward grinned triumphantly. "I told you she was kind." Daniel felt an unfamiliar warmth settle inside his guarded heart. "Lady Eliza," he asked quietly, "where will you stay tonight?" She hesitated. "I have not decided. Do you have family nearby?" Her fingers tightened around the valise. "No, friends," she shook her head. "Employment already arranged?" "No, your grace." The answer lingered heavily between them. Daniel understood what she had carefully avoided saying. She possessed nowhere to go. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, appeared near the gates after searching for the Duke. "Your grace, supper is nearly prepared." Daniel nodded absent-mindedly. Instead of walking away, he remained where he stood. Something within him resisted leaving the young woman alone upon that lonely roadside. Reason advised caution. Society demanded distance. Common sense insisted he continue home, yet every instinct born from compassion urged otherwise. He looked at Edward. The boy's hopeful expression revealed exactly what he was thinking. Then Daniel looked at Charlotte. The little girl still held Eliza's hand. Finally, he looked back into Eliza's tired eyes. She carried loneliness with such quiet courage that it reminded him painfully of the first weeks after losing his Duchess. He spoke carefully. "Would you honor my household by accepting dinner this evening?" Eliza immediately attempted to refuse. "I could never impose. It is not an imposition. I have nothing to offer in return. My invitation requires nothing." She searched his face, wondering whether pride should overcome desperation. Before she answered, Edward spoke. "Please come." Charlotte whispered softly, "I don't want you to be hungry." Those innocent words accomplished what polite persuasion could not. Eliza bowed her head. "I would be grateful, Mrs. Whitmore welcomed her inside without the slightest hint of judgment, instructing servants to prepare a guest chamber. Fresh tea arrived beside a warm fire. A simple supper followed, filled with gentle conversation rather than uncomfortable questions. Edward eagerly described his writing lessons. Charlotte proudly displayed her repaired doll. Daniel mostly listened, watching the children laugh more freely than they had in months. After the meal, they gathered within the drawing room while rain tapped gently against tall windows. Daniel finally asked the question he had postponed all evening. "What do you intend to do tomorrow?" Eliza answered honestly. I shall seek respectable employment. As what? A governess, perhaps a companion, whatever honest work I can find. You deserve better than uncertainty. She smiled sadly. Deserving and receiving are rarely companions. Daniel leaned back thoughtfully. His late wife had often reminded him that kindness demanded courage, especially when society expected convenience instead. He remembered her final request spoken from her sickbed. Raise them in a home filled with love, not loneliness. For 2 years he had tried. For 2 years Blackwood Hall had remained painfully incomplete. He watched Charlotte resting comfortably beside Eliza. Edward sat close enough to ask endless questions. Neither child seemed guarded anymore. Something extraordinary had happened in only a single evening. Daniel stood and walked toward the fireplace. He remained silent for several moments before turning back. Lady Eliza, she rose respectfully, you told me you have no family left. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. I have no one. Daniel looked first at Edward, then Charlotte. Finally he met Eliza's eyes. Perhaps my children have been waiting for a mother. She stared at him, unable to breathe. And perhaps, he continued quietly, you have been waiting for a family. The room fell utterly silent as impossible hope bloomed between four lonely hearts at once together forever. Eliza remained motionless, convinced she had misunderstood the Duke's astonishing words. The fire crackled softly between them, while Edward and Charlotte looked from one adult to the other with innocent curiosity. Daniel himself seemed surprised by what he had spoken, as though the thought had lived silently within his heart long before finding its voice. For several moments no one spoke. The silence was neither awkward nor cold. Instead, it carried the fragile weight of lives standing at the edge of an entirely unexpected future. I cannot accept such generosity without understanding it, Eliza finally whispered. Daniel inclined his head. Then allow me to explain. He invited her to sit once more, and Mrs. Whitmore quietly ushered the children toward the adjoining morning room with warm milk and honey cakes, giving the adults privacy. Edward reluctantly obeyed, though not before casting one hopeful smile toward Eliza. Charlotte waved shyly, clutching her repaired doll as though it had suddenly become a treasured symbol of trust. When the door closed, Daniel stood beside the fireplace. My proposal is not born from impulse alone, he began. For 2 years I have devoted every waking hour to this estate and to my children. They are loved, cared for, and protected, yet they are growing without a mother's guidance. Servants may keep a household running, they cannot heal a family's heart. Eliza listened quietly. I loved my wife deeply, he continued. Nothing could replace her. I seek neither to erase her memory nor pretend grief no longer exists. I would never ask that of you. I know, he paused before speaking again. Nor do I offer empty romance, I offer honesty. Those words reached Eliza more deeply than grand declarations ever could. She folded her hands tightly upon her lap. You know almost nothing about me. I know enough. I have no fortune. I possess sufficient for us all. My family name carries little influence now. I require character, not connections. I arrive with one valise. You carry dignity, that is rarer. Eliza lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by kindness she felt she had not earned. Why would you trust a stranger? Daniel answered without hesitation. I have watched my children all evening. She looked up. They trusted you before I did. His quiet certainty left her without argument. Still, practical fears remained. The Tun will not understand. The Tun rarely understands compassion. They will say I trapped a grieving duke. They already invent stories without assistance. She almost smiled. It would damage your reputation. My reputation has survived parliament, lawsuits, and newspapers. I believe it can survive kindness. A faint laugh escaped her before she realized it. Daniel noticed. It has been some time since you laughed. I scarcely remember how. I should like Blackwood Hall to remind you. The sincerity in his voice made tears gather once again. I am afraid. So am I, she blinked. You. I have made countless decisions affecting thousands of acres and hundreds of tenants. None has frightened me more than asking whether one lonely woman might consider building a home beside mine. His admission dissolved the remaining distance between them. Neither pretended certainty, neither disguised vulnerability. Both understood loss. Both understood loneliness. Outside, the rain had finally ceased. Moonlight slipped through the tall windows, casting silver patterns across polished floors that had witnessed generations of Ravenscroft history. Daniel walked toward the mantelpiece where a framed miniature portrait rested. My wife, Catherine. Eliza stood respectfully beside him. The painted Duchess possessed gentle eyes and an expression filled with quiet warmth. She was beautiful. She was. You still love her. I always shall. Eliza nodded, as you should. Daniel turned toward her. Can you live in a house where another woman's memory is honored? I would never compete with cherished memories. You would not resent them. No, love does not disappear because another chapter begins. Those simple words settled deeply within Daniel's heart. Mrs. Whitmore returned softly to announce that the guest chamber had been prepared. The children wished me to tell your grace they have already begun arguing over which gardens Lady Eliza should see tomorrow. Daniel smiled despite himself. They appear remarkably confident. So do I, the housekeeper replied gently before withdrawing again. The remark lingered. Eliza looked toward the staircase leading to the guest rooms. I asked heaven for shelter, she said quietly. I never imagined it would answer with a family. Daniel stepped no closer, unwilling to pressure her. I ask only that you consider my proposal. For how long? As long as you need, she shook her head slowly. If I wait too long, courage may abandon me. He remained silent. She drew one steady breath. There must be conditions. His expression softened. Name them. I will never replace your Duchess. You shall not. I will treat Edward and Charlotte as my own. I hoped you would. Our marriage must always be founded upon honesty. It shall. If affection comes, it must come naturally. It cannot be commanded. She searched his face one final time, finding neither calculation nor desperation, only quiet sincerity. Then she extended her trembling hand. I will try. Daniel accepted it with profound respect rather than triumph. You honor us. Before either could speak again, hurried footsteps echoed along the corridor. Edward burst into the drawing room, unable to contain himself. Father, Mrs. Whitmore said I mustn't interrupt, but Charlotte insisted we should ask. Daniel raised an amused eyebrow. Ask what? The young heir looked directly at Eliza. Would it be terribly improper if we started calling you family already? Eliza's composure finally surrendered. She knelt before both children as Charlotte hurried after her brother and wrapped tiny arms around her neck. For the first time since leaving her childhood home years before, she no longer felt like the last surviving branch of a forgotten family. She felt at last as though she belonged somewhere. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Blackwood Hall, washing the ancient stone walls with gentle gold. For the first time in many years, Eliza awoke without wondering where she would sleep the following night. The uncertainty that had haunted every mile of her journey had quietly given way to something unfamiliar yet precious: hope. She dressed carefully, still wearing the modest gown in which she had arrived, and paused before the bedroom window, gazing across the sprawling estate that had transformed from a stranger's home into the place where an entirely new life might begin. Downstairs, the breakfast table was already lively. Edward enthusiastically described plans to explore the stables, while Charlotte insisted Eliza should see the rose garden before anything else. Daniel watched his children with quiet astonishment. Only yesterday morning they had moved through the house with practiced silence, their laughter buried beneath years of mourning. Now they argued cheerfully over who would spend more time with their unexpected guest. Their happiness alone convinced him that his extraordinary proposal had not been born from foolish impulse, but from gentle providence. After breakfast, Daniel suggested they walk through the grounds before discussing practical matters. The gardens stretched across rolling lawns bordered by ancient oaks, reflecting pools and carefully tended flowerbeds prepared for winter. Edward raced ahead with his wooden sword, pretending to defend the estate from imaginary invaders, while Charlotte gathered fallen leaves into neat little bouquets. Eliza smiled as she watched them, realizing she had begun thinking of their laughter not as something she merely witnessed, but as something she already treasured. They eventually reached the small family chapel overlooking the valley. Ivy climbed its weathered stone walls, and colorful glass windows caught the morning light. Daniel paused beside two marble benches facing a row of carefully tended graves. One white headstone bore the name Catherine Ravenscroft. Fresh autumn flowers rested before it. Daniel removed his hat respectfully. Eliza did the same. Neither spoke for several moments, allowing silence to express what words never adequately could. At last Daniel broke the quiet. I bring the children here every Sunday. It is beautiful. They still tell their mother everything. Eliza smiled gently. I believe she still listens. He looked toward her. I hope she would approve of yesterday. I think any loving mother would rejoice knowing her children have found reason to smile again. Daniel drew a slow breath. I choose to believe that. As they walked back toward the manor, Mrs. Whitmore hurried across the courtyard carrying several letters. Your Grace, these arrived early this morning. Daniel accepted the correspondence before noticing one addressed to Lady Eliza. It appears someone has finally found you. She examined the unfamiliar handwriting before carefully opening the envelope. Inside lay a short note from the family solicitor. He explained that while reviewing the late Dowager Lady's personal effects, servants had discovered one final sealed letter hidden within a prayer book. The Dowager had written it only days before her passing. Eliza's hands trembled as she unfolded the delicate paper. My dearest Eliza, If these words reach you, then heaven has called me home before we embraced again. Forgive an old woman's failing strength. Remember always that true family is not measured only by blood, but by those who willingly carry your burdens beside you. If kindness finds you when all else seems lost, do not mistake it for chance. Receive it with gratitude and answer it with love. That choice will bless more lives than you can imagine. With all my affection, your devoted aunt. Tears slipped quietly down Eliza's cheeks. Daniel waited patiently until she folded the letter once more. It seems, she whispered, she has answered my doubts. He smiled softly, then perhaps I should ask again. They stopped beneath the great oak overlooking Blackwood Hall. The children, sensing something important, wandered no farther. Daniel faced Eliza with calm sincerity. Lady Eliza Ashcombe, I cannot promise a life without sorrow. No honest man could. I cannot promise that society will always approve, nor that every season will be easy. But I can promise respect, loyalty, friendship, and a home where your kindness will always be valued. If in time affection grows between us, I shall count myself blessed beyond measure. Will you become my wife and help me raise these two remarkable children? Edward held his breath. Charlotte squeezed Eliza's hand. Eliza looked from the hopeful faces of the children to the quiet strength in Daniel's eyes. 24 hours earlier, she had believed herself completely alone. Now she stood surrounded by the very thing she had thought impossible. She answered with gentle certainty, "Yes, your grace." "I will," Charlotte laughed first, throwing her little arms around Eliza's waist. Edward followed a heartbeat later. "We truly have a family now." Daniel stepped forward not with dramatic celebration but with humble gratitude. He took Eliza's hand and kissed her gloved fingers respectfully. "Welcome home, your grace." Together they turned toward Blackwood Hall, where servants already smiled from distant windows, sensing joy returning to halls long shadowed by grief. As the great front doors opened before them, sunlight flooded the entrance, and Eliza crossed the threshold not as a lonely woman carrying a single worn valise, but as the future Duchess of Blackwood embraced by two waiting children, and a good man who had discovered that sometimes the greatest acts of courage begin with simple compassion, quiet faith, and the willingness to call a stranger family forever thereafter together, always united in hope, love, grace, and homes.